I was teaching a class, it was a couple of years ago at the World Bank. Quite a few hundred people who went through a meditation training there. And I would often do this exercise where I asked people to close their eyes. And I said, when you think of the word meditation, what words come into your mind? You just kind of popcorn them out. And people would say, peace, tranquility, no thoughts. And then there was someone in the back of the room and a little smirk on their face. And they said, obsessive thinking, pain, and humiliation. And I said, oh, you meditate. If you've meditated, you know how challenging it can be to simply relax and be present. Many, many years ago, I was in a big life transition, and I called my best friend from college, who was also in kind of a big life transition, and I said, hey, I've signed up for this month-long meditation retreat. Why don't you come too? It'll be fun. And of course, it turned out to be a total gut-wrenching, humiliating, and liberating and transforming experience. So when I went off to do a 10-day retreat up in Massachusetts, it's very much like when my wife gives me a certain look and says, we need to talk. I know I'll be glad I did it, but I'm not really looking forward to the experience. So I spent 10 days, my wife and I went up to a place called the Forest Refuge in central Massachusetts. It's affiliated with the Insight Meditation Society in Barre. And this Forest Refuge is a beautiful, beautiful facility. It is designed for long-term, unstructured retreats. So it's on a beautiful area with it must be about 100 acres of beautiful New England forests. And the facility is designed for practice. So you have your own room, there are little walking rooms where you can go, and a beautiful meditation hall and so forth. On our way up there, we stopped in Pennsylvania to visit my father in his Alzheimer's unit. And I'm getting more comfortable going there, because it's, basically, there are a lot of people who are, really struggling mentally, but, the rooms, there's spacious rooms, and there are just a lot of people sort of, sitting quietly, or, people walking, very, very slowly, and we had a good visit. It was great to see my dad. And then we went up to the Forest Refuge, where there were all these people in silence sitting around in rooms, and all these people walking really slowly. It was like, oh my God. None of the rooms had locks on them. It was like, what have I done to myself here? It was very powerful to step away. In the days are really quite unstructured. If you go to kind of a more traditional retreat, you have a very kind of structured, rigid day, where you sit for 45 minutes, you walk for 45 minutes, you sit for 45 minutes, there's a talk, every night. So you're kind of on a structure where you're sort of carried by the schedule. In a place like Forest Refuge, which is designed for long-term private retreats, there's really no structure. They're the set meals, but there are only 2 talks a week and only 2 private interviews a week for just 15 minutes. So you're kind of on your own, which can be a good thing or not. But I wanted to share some of my observations and share some of the practices that I explored with you. Because it's no different whether you're sitting down for a 20-minute meditation or you're going on a long retreat. You're going through particular stages of training as you go through it, and going through working with waves of challenges as they arise. So to share a little bit about what I noticed, I'd like to talk a little bit tonight about what it means to establish concentration, and then what it means to establish mindfulness. and what it means to establish the capacity to be with the waves and the fluctuations that occur in the body and in the mind and in the emotions. And then a little bit on the practice of surrender, the practice of really just letting go into your experience. So there are many, many schools of thought around how to create presence. Many, many different doorways. We explored in this meditation the doorway of sound, which some people find to be very, very helpful, because you really do recognize that by using sound as a tool, you begin to see that, hey, the sounds are not, I don't have any control over the sounds, but it's simply me as sort of being the knower of sound. And you can really begin to see into those three characteristics of reality, how they're always changing, that anywhere you fixate, there's some quality of unsatisfactoriness or stress, and that it's very impersonal. The sounds don't have anything to do with you. So I read a book by kind of a wild man who I really enjoy, because he's quite a reverend, but he's done a lot of practice. And his name is Daniel Ingram, and he wrote a book called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, which is actually offered, I think it's a PDF download. You can also buy the book as well, but he kind of made it freely available. And he studied quite a bit in the tradition of the kind of the Mahasi Sayadaws, who have a particular approach. And the practice that they primarily use is what's called noting, which is making a mental note of your experience as it happens. So there are a number of things about his particular teachings that I just found very intriguing, and I wanted to take them on, and they seem a little far out, and they are a little far out. But primarily what you do in noting, and I'd like to talk a little bit about how noting happens, and we'll try it on, see what it's like. But in the particular prescription that I used, in my primary attempt in the beginning was to establish concentration. Because I'd just come from a very, very busy time in my life, just as we all are in a very, very busy time in our days. So we want to use some concentration technique to bring ourselves present, to gather our attention, and to begin the process of calming, calming this drunken monkey stung by scorpions of a mind that we have. So the noting can be sort of a labeling of your experience. So when a thought occurs, just say thinking. Or if there's restlessness, to note restlessness. And this can have a very powerful way of sort of developing the strength of this witness, this capacity to self-observe. And when you can name something, you sort of sever your attachment to it in a sense. As I often say in the shamanic traditions, they say if you can name a fear, you take its power away. And again, you may not fully take its power away, but you've created a little bit of separation between you and that phenomena as it arises. So there are different ways that you can do noting. Listening, sound. The approach that I found helpful, that I sort of organically moved to, was sort of what I would use as kind of like, I call it sort of like a passive noting. So the words that I would use for myself were, for example, sounds are known. Sensations are known. Thinking is known. And what I like about that sort of semantic structure is it's not like I am aware of sounds, but who I am is the knower. I am the one who is aware of it. So again, it sort of takes away the doer, and it's more of sort of a naming of what's happening in the moment. So how do you bring your attention to the here and now? Now, in the Buddhist tradition, and I'll talk a little bit about kind of what the Buddha actually said in this practice, we're using the body, we're using sensations as the primary anchor. So the classical is the breath. And the breath is always there. But we're not limited to the breath. There can be sounds, it can be a particular location in the body, it can be scanning through the body. Lots of different skillful means, and different traditions really explicitly go into particular approaches. Some traditions will say you must strictly keep your attention at the nostrils. Others say, no, keep the attention in the belly. No, keep the attention on the breath outside the body, which is very, very subtle, outside the rim of the nostrils. I think the best practice is wherever you feel the breath the most predominant, track that because it'll move and it'll change, but it keeps it more alive than just sort of getting into a static practice that becomes sort of stale and organic. Now the question becomes, let's say you bring your attention to your breath, and that becomes your anchor, and you sort of make a determination. So for this meditation, I'm going to stay with the breath. Now the question is, how intimately can you notice what's happening? So there's a level of mental noting. So sounds are known, restlessness is known, irritation is known. So you're naming it as it arises, sort of like liberating the phenomena as they arise by sort of noting it. But here's where it got really, really far out for me. What Daniel Ingram offers is sort of this challenge to practice, and this is pretty outrageous, like 10 notings per second. Now, how I kind of broke that down for myself, kind of being a photographer and kind of playing with like video and film in my life, is that when you see a moving image, if you're watching a movie, you're watching usually either 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second. So that image is comprised of many, many, many still images that are sort of kind of rolling through at a speed that we perceive as sound and as movement. So what I practiced for myself was, well, let me try 3 notings per second. Is it possible for me to kind of break down my experience to 3 notings per moment? And when you practice this, and we'll try it in a few minutes, is that you can't track it mentally. You can mentally note, sort of an emotion or thinking or a kind of a gross experience that arises. But when you're sort of narrowing your attention down to like 3 frames per second or even 10 frames per second, you can't do it mentally. But there can be quite a profound sort of shift in experiencing that intimate immediacy as it's arising. Very, very subtle. To get into a concentrated place like that, it's helpful to be on a long retreat, but it's utterly doable. So why don't we try this just for a few minutes? If you like, you can close your eyes. And you might like to use the breath just for this little experiment. And I'd like to invite you, just as a way to sort of enter into this, to slow down your breath. And you might even explore like breathing in slowly to the count of 3, and then exhaling slowly to the count of 3. And just play around with this. It's a very intuitive thing. Is it possible to kind of break down each second into, say, 3 different segments? And the ground here is the sensate experience. It's the experience in sensation. And you may notice, and then we'll take a minute or two just to practice that, if you really focus on the breath, then you will become more intimately aware of this big space between the in-breath and the out-breath. So for the next minute, what do you notice as you practice? Can you sense any particular imprint or effect from the practice? If you like, you can remain with your eyes closed, or if you like, you can open your eyes. There's a quality to this very, very intense, concentrated attention. It can be really frustrating. It can be kind of enervating. But you may have experienced perhaps a little bit of absorption, maybe a little bit of calming. And what I found over the course of my practice of hours and hours and days is that you really shift from a mental place, a cognitive place, to a very experiential place. And you may have noticed possibly a sense of your experience almost being vibrational. It has like a sort of a vibrational quality to it. And as Daniel Ingram describes it, it's sort of like, it's sort of your experience is going to like strobe a little bit, you know. Here's what the Buddha said in the Satipatthana Sutta, which is kind of the basic instructions he offered. This is the direct path for the purification of beings, for the overcoming of sorrow and lamentation, for the disappearance of pain and distress, for the attainment of the right method, and for the realization of the unbinding. That's a pretty hefty selling point. There is the case where a monk remains focused on the body in and of itself, ardent, alert, and mindful, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. She remains focused on feelings in and of themselves, ardent, alert, and mindful, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. So when you focus your attention on the sensations and you pay that level of attention, that's sort of like 3 frames or 10 frames per second, it's impossible to be thinking about the world, your distress of the world. And over time, there can be a deepening and deepening presence in the experience that can be quite wonderful. The Buddha goes on and says, breathing in long, she discerns, I am breathing in long. Or breathing out short, she discerns, I am breathing out short. She trains herself, I will breathe in sensitive to the entire body. I will breathe out sensitive to the entire body. I will breathe in calming bodily fabrication. I will breathe out calming bodily fabrication. So this is the practice of concentration, of shamatha. There's a soothing quality to it. Very, very challenging. But as you establish concentration, it's a very, very cool state. And there's a lot to go into about some of the different states, the different levels of the jhanas, the concentration practices where there are very, very powerful qualities of mind, in that sensitivity. When you can begin to experience, moving from the cognitive to being more and more deeply, deeply embedded in the here and now, this sense of life being vibrational, this life force being vibrational. So oftentimes on a retreat, and in the same way, when you sit down to meditation, we often use concentration in the beginning. There's kind of a willful quality, there's an effort quality, and the result of that effort will be calming and soothing, a sense of presence, a sense of here and now. And what I found in my own experience was the more I would get into a concentrated place, the more I would sort of experience. The only way I could describe it was the quality of presence, just feeling very, very present. And there was sort of like a white noise quality that would come with it. So the next step, as we get concentrated, is to establish mindfulness. And in this particular approach, as you become more present, you actively contemplate the three characteristics of reality, of anicca, dukkha, and anatta. So what I would do in my practice, this is kind of like where I landed, sort of like my formula, which will sort of shift and change, but it was pretty powerful for a couple days, is that I would begin this practice of trying to sort of recognize the 10 notings per second, or the 3 notings per second, as challenging as that was. Sometimes I would sort of access a quality of presence, sometimes it was just, my mind was like a squirrel on coffee, just impossible to control. But I would go into the practice of noting. Restlessness is known. Thoughts are known. Sound is known. Hunger is known. Just sort of naming what's arising out of the sort of the sensate world or out of the mental world. And at times I could sort of get into a concentrated place, sort of like based in the sensations. And then I would just sort of mentally note, this is all changing. Just reminding myself, this is all changing. And then I would remind myself, anywhere there is attachment, there is suffering or stress. Just to remind myself, like anything I hold on to will ultimately have some quality of stress or dissatisfaction. Now, the concept of anatta, of not self, is challenging thing to wrap your brain around, but the words that I used was, I am not here. Like the I, my personality is not here. There is a knower that is here, but the personality is not here. This became a very, very powerful cycle. Get established in the sensations, in the here and now. And constantly go through this cycle of reminding myself, everything is changing. Anything I hold on to will result in suffering. I am not here. I am the knower. I am awareness. And I would continue with the noting. Sometimes it would be sort of mental noting, like agitation is happening, or calmness is known, presence is known. So let's try this one on, just for a few minutes, see what it's like. So you might again just let your attention begin to ride with the breath. You're not controlling the breath. It might be naturally or organically long, naturally and organically short. Or you might use sounds. And for a few rounds, I'll offer this little remembrance of these 3 characteristics, and it will take maybe another minute for you to practice on your own. As you anchor your attention in the sensate world. All this is constantly changing. Where there is attachment, there will be stress or suffering. I am not here. And we'll take the next minute, again, anchoring in the senses and reflecting on these 3 characteristics of reality. when you remember that everything is in constant change and evolution, that anything you hold on to will result in stress or unsatisfactoriness, and conversely, anything you can let be opens up freedom. And when you allow the sense of I and mine to melt away, what is the result? And gently deepening your breath. And if you like, you can remain with your eyes closed, or you can let your eyes open. This practice is a very, very deep contemplation of reality. And the word sati in the Satipatthana Sutta is translated as mindfulness. Mindfulness, I translate as non-judging awareness. But another translation of sati is remembering or remembrance. And it's this remembering that everything is changing. This remembering that anything you hold on to will ultimately be unsatisfying. And that the sense of who you are is not the personality. And who you are is knowing who you are is awareness. Whenever we can remember this, there can be an opening, there can be a softening, there can be a receiving, there can be new possibilities where they didn't exist before. So I found days and days of coming back to this to be very, very helpful. Because what I noticed was that I would have lots of unpleasant experiences. And when I could remember that they're going to change, that was helpful. I also had a lot of really powerful, sort of non-ordinary, really juicy states as well. And it was really helpful to remember that these too will change, because I really, really liked those states, and I really didn't want them to go away. So this is the practice. We establish ourselves in the here and now. We remember these qualities of reality. And what happens whenever we practice meditation is that there is a calming, there is a wonderful quality of wholesomeness that can emerge. And at the same time, anyone who's meditated knows that it's a transformational practice. If you've ever ever done a fast, where you sort of stop eating junky food and start eating really, really good things, it's like you're pouring fresh water into a glass of ink. You pour in the fresh water, the ink starts to be flushed out. So that's inevitably part of the practice. And then the question becomes, how do we ride the waves? How do we ride the fluctuations that occur when you really, really start intimately and sincerely investigating the nature of reality? Because you begin to realize how much, well, let me make that an I statement. I began to realize how much I was holding on to that I had no idea I was holding on to it. And that's the power and the beauty of this transformational practice. My retreat was not all fun and games. Sometimes there were deeply profound states of stillness, amazingly beautiful states of gratitude, of immeasurable states of compassion and joy. The land there was just beautiful, and going on these mindful walks was really quite stunning. Deep experience of centeredness, of connectedness, the whole thing of just being like released. And when I remember I finished one of my interviews, and I thought, oh great, I don't have to talk for the next 3 days. It was pretty cool. On the other hand, there were also challenges. The meals were nutritious, but really, really simple. You know, as I said, they were kind of like gruel in the morning and gruel at night. You know, not a lot of excitement there. I had one experience where there was sort of a salad. You know, they sort of like, you know, very, very simple food, very, you know, pretty, very healthy food, very, very mindful in it. But I would have a little bit of sauerkraut, you know, with my salad. You know, it was fermented food, digestion, all that stuff. And so I was sort of, I sat in this rocking chair and I was sort of mindfully, you know, finishing up the sauerkraut, and it was suddenly it was like so unbelievably unpleasant, you know. And I thought, oh my God, did someone try to eat this already? You know. And I found out later it was kimchi, and I had taken it. I had taken kimchi instead, and it was like really fermented kimchi. It reminded me of this joke of this guy sitting there's a guy sitting in a bar, and he's just sitting there looking at this little bowl with a clam and a little thing of butter next to it. And this guy says, you know, what are you looking so sad for? And the guy said, you know, I just can't eat this thing. The guy said, well, it's really easy. You just sort of take the clam, you dip it in the butter, and you pop it in your mouth. And he popped it in his mouth. And the guy said, you know, I tried that 3 times and I couldn't keep it down. That was one of those little surprises, you know? Ooh, unpleasant sensation. You have a yogi job when you're there. Some people get, you know, sort of dishwashing. Some people get, you know, household. And I got pot washing, which was the let's stick it to him. So, you know, hunched over a blue plastic tub, and one day it was about an hour and 15 minutes of scrubbing pots. And at one point I just thought, are these guys bringing stuff from home? You know, there are only 26 people on retreat. You know, there can't be this much food. You know? I thought, is this the transmission of a 64 Chevy that I'm like scrubbing out right now? What is this? One day I went for a long run. I went for like a 3-mile run. It was so ecstatic, and I felt good the next day. And then in the evening, I was sitting, and I usually sit in a chair, but I sat on a cushion, and then I could barely stand up. My back just seized up. So the whole experience changed for me, and suddenly it became sort of this ecstatic, free being in these sort of altered states, you know, concentration, relaxation, to suddenly being in a huge amount of pain. But the essential practice was the same. You know, the anchor now wasn't the breath. The anchor was working with my left hip and my lower back that was all seized up, and noticing. And what I began to notice was, like, at one point I was like, ruthlessness is known. You know, just this ruthless, critical mind. And as soon as I recognized that, I began to sort of explore the opposite, of sort of really like befriending this pain. And it became a very powerful shift and an internal softening of a different strategy that was really quite powerful. Not that it went away. The rest of the retreat, I was in a fair bit of pain. But I was so struck by the power and sort of the risk implied in consciously moving from the cognitive to the experience. Anytime we sit down to meditate, we're moving from the mind to the experience. And my mind, of course, so desperately wanted to figure out how to nuke this pain and make it go away. But I did my best to sort of stay with the sensations, to not add anything to the sensation, like not to add mental turmoil or self-criticism, but just to be with the sensation as it was. And I had a very, very powerful moment where I was getting up from my chair and sort of like pressing down into my thighs as I was getting up, And I had sort of this kinesthetic memory of my father, who actually, for many years, wore a back brace, from here down to his waist, just kind of bound up his whole back. And it was a kinesthetic memory. It was like, oh, this is what he felt, or what I imagined he felt. And a whole reflection on how, as a teenager and being the narcissist I was, I never really paid attention. But it became a very powerful experience to really open my heart to that experience, to really include that into my experience. And I was really like, I'm so sorry that I didn't notice and wasn't more compassionate at that time. It was quite powerful. Another time, and again, I don't have much time, but I'd like to talk about sort of like the anatomy of an insight. This practice is sometimes called insight meditation. So how do these insights come? And you think of an insight is seeing your experience from a new perspective, from sort of like a new plane of consciousness. How do we get there? Usually our strategy is to try to figure it out. That's what we rely on, this linear rational mind, judging, comparing, trying to figure it out. Somehow when we can not judge, not compare, and not try to figure it out, something can arise sort of spontaneously. So just a little story of my mind sort of flashed on a relationship that I had been, like maybe 12 years ago. Wonderful, wonderful, beautiful person. And it just, a number of events happened and it just didn't work. And there was just a lot of pain and sort of like a cutting off that happened. And it never felt resolved for me. And not to go into a whole lot of detail, but at one point, the other person wanted more of a commitment and I just wasn't there for it. And the other person said, well, then we cannot communicate. I can never, do not contact me, do not ever talk to me again. And then a number of months later, then, there's sort of like an opening to sort of revisiting the relationship. But it was a very, very loving, incredible relationship. And I could never figure out why that relationship never worked. And I realized that when her reaction was, don't ever contact me, how deeply that hurt. That actually hurt and kicked off a level of distrust for me, where I could not open up again. And there was something so powerful about getting the deep ouch, like that deep, honest sense of what that felt like in my body, not what I thought about it. That was quite a powerful process for me, of really recognizing my own pain and then the flood of the pain that I imagined she was feeling at the same time. So insights occur when we suspend any intention to try to figure out our life. They arise, they happen. And this to me is sort of the process of transformation. And ultimately what it brings us to is really to the ultimate question of what are you? This third characteristic of reality. We identify with our minds, primarily. We identify with our stories, kind of our biography. And so, who you are is your biography. It's the causes and conditions. Your primary caretakers, your culture, the beliefs that were formed, your self-protective strategies. All of that is part of who you are. But there's something beyond that, because as the Buddha said, anything that's born out of causes and conditions is subject to change. Something you may have believed your entire life, you might deeply examine and you won't believe it anymore. So all of that is subject to change. So when you explore this quality of I and mine, and who you are in the absence of I and mine, which is the whole last third of the talk, which we won't have time for, it becomes a very powerful inquiry. I found on this retreat, one of the really interesting things about wandering the woods sort of meditatively, being careful of my back not going into spasm, but through these woods in New England, you find these incredible stone walls, these pastures that were built that are now overgrown. It's just a pure forest. But it was this really powerful recognition of the generations that have come before, with all of their hopes and dreams and wanting to create by building this back-breaking labor. Those people are gone. There's no story. I have no idea who they were, where they came from. Sort of imagine they were, British, because a lot of the stone walls looked like walls I'd seen in Great Britain. But in that same way, there's a very powerful reflection that I too am passing through. And that in a generation or two, my name will not be on too many people's lips. But there's also something very, very powerful about that recognition, because it gives us access to this capacity to truly receive the moment and let it be and let it flow. So I'm aware of the time. But I thank you for your patient listening. I hope these practices might be of interest for you. They might resonate for you, they might not. And I think, again, part of exploring meditation is really developing yourself as a contemplative artist. You're finding the techniques that really match and they really resonate for you. So I thank you for your openness. As you center your attention on the breath, on the aliveness of the senses. Remembering impermanence, this characteristic of reality. Anything born of causes and conditions is subject to change. Remembering this quality of dukkha, anything you hold on to in the slightest degree will result in some quality of unsatisfactoriness, unsteadiness, of stress or suffering. And in these final moments, reflecting on anatta, this principle of not self, the sense of who you are as the knower of your experience, who you are as vast, infinite, immeasurable awareness. Reflecting on this poem from Dorothy Hunt. Do you think peace requires an end to war? Or tigers eating only vegetables? Does peace require an absence from your boss, your spouse, yourself? Do you think peace will come from some other place other than here? Some other time than now? In some other heart than yours? Peace is this moment without judgment. That is all. This moment in the heart space where everything that is welcome. Peace is this moment without thinking that it should be some other way, that you should feel some other thing, that your life should unfold according to your plans. Peace is this moment without judgment. This moment in the heart space where everything that is welcome. Thank you again for your kind attention. Happy Martin Luther King Day. Do stay for tea, which is out in the lobby if you like.